If you or somebody you know is suffering from depression, you really need to pay attention to some of the things I'm going to tell you in this video. I've worked for over 20 years across a number of different areas in health, and I did quite a period of time in acute mental health, and that's the area where people can be actively suicidal. And what I noticed is when I was working there, the experts in those areas seemed to ignore a lot of stuff that was absolutely vital to try and fix. And what I also noticed was that these people would get a diagnosis of a mental health condition, especially depression, while these other things were just blatantly ignored. I was fairly fortunate to use my prior knowledge and to help lots of people who had these chronic diagnoses, and that means diagnoses that were lasting for years or longer, and I was able to help them to actually fully, in some cases, alleviate their symptoms and get better from depression. And it's not so complicated once you understand some of the fundamentals, which I'm going to tell you about. When I actually started working in the acute area of mental health, one of my questions to my colleagues was why we don't focus more on gut health. And I was asked a question by some of the senior guys there about 3 or 4 different times why. And my answer was because that's where serotonin is produced. It's produced in your stomach. And these people challenged me and said, no, that's not true. And I had about 2 or 3 incidences where people did a Google search and then they turned around and said, wow, I never knew that. So we have these experts who are treating depression and anxiety who don't or didn't realize that serotonin is actually produced in your stomach. Now, serotonin is probably the most important neurotransmitter in relation to depression. And it's responsible for keeping our mood stable or keeping our mood good. And there are a few things that we are doing in our modern day living which disrupt serotonin production. And I'm going to break those down and go through them. We have this complex system in our guts. It's called our microbiome. And in fact, we have microbiomes in other places as well, including on our skin. But the bacteria in our stomach actually play a role in making some of the serotonin and also a role in how the serotonin is used within our bodies. And once we start understanding this, then we can do something about it. When I mention the word stress, people automatically think of this idea of a psychological thing that's happening to them that puts their mood or changes how they go about their day. And stress, to be more accurate, can be broken down into 3 components. You can have physical stress, you can have psychological stress, and then you can have toxic stress. And once people start to realize that modern living, especially in a Western environment, we are under attack from all sorts of toxicities every day. And a lot of how I try and help people deal with psychological conditions, especially depression, is to do something about changing this attack from the toxic stress. The next thing that people have to realize is that the majority of food we're eating is actually harming us and it's poisoning us. And I'll break down why that's the case. We are kind of conditioned now to eat these highly processed foods, rich carbohydrate diets, lots of sugars. And these things are actually creating different mixes of the types of bacteria which we need to stay healthy. And they are making the bacteria, which is not good, explode. There was a very interesting study done on dogs where dogs were transferred bacteria of one type and it changed their sense of smell so that they would actively seek out a different sort of food. So it could be argued that if we're feeding certain types of bacteria with the wrong diet, these bacteria can drive our senses to actively seek food that is bad for us. So one of the first things to consider is the type of food we're eating. And if you're eating a diet rich in sugar and rich in carbohydrates, you're actually having explosions of bad bacteria in your stomach. Now, the next thing is that we have, if we're moving away from processed foods and if we're reducing our sugar, we might think that we're actually eating a healthy diet, and the sad fact is that we are not. All that lovely looking fruit and those lovely looking vegetables that you see in your supermarket and lots of your meat and lots of your other more natural stuff is heavily poisoned. Your food has got tons of glyphosate, pesticides, herbicides, and these kill off the bacteria in your stomach. Also, a lot of our foods and vegetables are monofarmed, so they're stuck in soil which doesn't have all these nice healthy micronutrients get into it, and it also is sprayed heavily, so it doesn't have that nice bacteria which we need to make our guts work properly. The next thing to be aware of is that our meat and our dairy is also poisoned. We have these animals that are being bred in incredibly harmful conditions. They're stressed, they're loaded up with antibiotics, they're fed food which is in no way good for them or natural for them. They are also eating food which is loaded with herbicides and pesticides. They're given all sorts of medicines and treatments so they don't get sick themselves. And we're eating this stuff which essentially, as I said, comes from sick animals. The water we're drinking comes from treatment plants, and because it's treated, it has chemicals put in it to stop us getting sick from bacteria. And unfortunately, those chemicals are harmful for us and they're also making us sick. So one of the first really important steps to making a huge difference to improving depression is getting on a clean and an organic diet, and also getting clean water into your system. Sometimes what happens is all these chemicals and these particles and these nasty things build up in our bodies. And one of the best ways to reduce or reverse the effects of these chemicals is actually to stop putting anything into our bodies. And the way we can do this is fasting. Now, the simplest form of fasting is a thing called intermittent fasting. And that simply means that you have a window every day where you eat. And for some people, it may be 12 hours. For some people, it may be 10 or 8. And some people go as far as just eating within a period of 6 hours and nothing else outside that period. To take fasting a little bit further, what you can do next is what's called a wet fast. And this would involve just only drinking some sort of fluid that's not calorie loaded and not eating anything for a period of 1, 2, 3, or even up to 5 days. And a more extreme version is just a water fast for any one of those kind of periods. Now, when you do that, what happens is you get a thing called autophagy, and your body wants to make energy. So what it does is it looks around to use your body to make the energy for itself. And it starts doing that by eating up the damaged cells first. And this autophagy can be an absolutely dramatic way of cleaning up your body. Next, we're going to talk about the lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system is just as extensive as the cardiovascular system, except the cardiovascular system has a heart which pumps your blood around your body, but the lymphatic system doesn't. You can think about your lymphatic system almost like the rubbish dump or the rubbish tip of your body. It collects lots of the toxins in it, but if you are not moving around, and nowadays we all have this sedentary lifestyle, you are not mobilizing that lymphatic system and you're not getting rid of the toxins that are building up in your body. So this is why exercise or movement is absolutely vital. Exercise also stimulates endorphins, which can improve your mood through another method, but one of the main reasons is to mobilize your lymphatic system. And it's a bit of a vicious circle. When we're depressed, we feel less like doing things and we feel more like being static and staying still or staying inside. But we have to take some of the first steps, both literally and figuratively, and start this movement happening. Another form of toxicity, which is always overlooked when we're looking at treatments for depression and anxiety, is the toxicity of blue light. Now, blue light stimulates cortisol, and cortisol is a stress hormone. So it's a little bit like adrenaline, except it has a much softer effect and it lasts over a longer period of time. And if you think about it, we are exposing ourselves to huge amounts of blue light, way in excess of what we used to do maybe 50 to 100 years ago. All our screens are packed with blue light. So essentially we have this mild stress effect and we don't get a chance to heal and repair. So if you have depression, you need to be looking at your exposure to screens, and you may have to look at drastically limiting this. You can try things like blue light blockers, and there's also settings in your screens and computers which you can adjust. Our minds are quite incredible things, so it's not just the blue light and the exposure to that that's coming from our devices, but it's also the content that you're watching. And sometimes our minds cannot really differentiate between looking at an action movie, for example, and actually being in that situation ourselves. So we have some of those same responses. Our blood pressure rises, our hearts speed up. And this, again, is another mild form of stress. In order to help treat depression, we need to be healing and repairing. And I've heard many so-called experts tell people when they have depression or mental health problems to go home and watch a movie. And I would be saying that that could be or is some of the worst advice that you can get. There's a researcher called Professor Irving Kirsch who I find absolutely brilliant. And he has done huge amounts of work into something called the placebo effect. And lots of his work suggests that the majority of the effect for any antidepressant is actually just the placebo effect. His work also shows that if you delay using antidepressants for 2 weeks, it can actually have the same outcome as you never having taken any antidepressants. So what I mean by that is we go to a doctor, we might have the symptoms of depression, we immediately get a tablet for that, but if you have the right support and you wait 2 weeks longer, you will have the same outcome as having not received any medication whatsoever. So you might think, well, I've just taken a tablet, so what? The problem is the tablets have lots of different side effects, and ironically, some of the side effects of antidepressants in particular are increased suicidality within the first couple of weeks of taking them, along with all the metabolic effects, the haziness, the impaired mental capacity, loss of libido, and the list goes on and on and on. We have tremendous amounts of information about the importance of human contact, and we have these pseudo tribes and forms of human contact in our phones and in our screens, and this is not the same as the real thing. So we find that we do our Zoom meetings, or we talk to people overseas, or we connect with our friends, or we do online dating, or whatever mechanism, but essentially another way of helping to alleviate the symptoms of depression is by trying to physically and directly connect with other people. Pets and animals are also fantastic to create this connection that sadly we seem to be missing more and more in modern life. And one of the final parts of the puzzle is something called the nocebo effect. And this is the opposite of the placebo effect. The nocebo effect, another name for this, is called medical hexing. And there's some very compelling papers, two in particular, which stand out. These two different people were both given diagnoses of liver cancer. Within roughly a 6-month period, they were told that they would die. They died within that period, and on autopsy, both people did not have cancer. So this means that the power of suggestion when they were told they had this terminal condition meant they manifested the symptoms and they died within this specific period. So what a doctor tells you or what a health professional tells you can have a dramatic, devastating effect on your condition if you're not careful. I know many people who are entrenched in the fact that they have this diagnosis and they accept that it cannot change. If you accept that your diagnosis cannot change and you can't get better, your chances of recovery are hugely reduced. Whereas if you can look at some of this type of information that I'm supplying to you and change this mechanism where you previously thought that you were trapped in a chronic and long-term diagnosis, and you decide that you have hope for the future and you have hope to change your chronic condition and get better, this can be a huge step in progressing to fix your depression.